So today it was a little bit of a departure in our tutorials. I've enjoyed recently going and doing a deep dive on many parts of the process. And I often pick the topics each week depending on whatever I'm doing a deep dive on in my work. It's fresh, I'm thinking about it, I'm inspired by it, and eager to share. But this week, I just thought it would be a good idea to take a step back and sort of look at the map. Where are we? Because I've been bouncing around and I just throw whatever topics at you sort of strike my fancy. But there is a logic to this. There's a process. And so today we're going to walk through the process from the beginning to the end. And if you've been following these tutorials or any of my materials, a lot of this is stuff you probably have heard, you probably know. But I don't know if you're like me. I'll reread a book or take a class from someone and think, oh my gosh, I knew that. How did I forget? I've gotten in the weeds and I need a reminder. So I hope today will serve as a helpful reminder and maybe a diagnostic. If you're stuck somewhere, you can know maybe where you're stuck and where you are headed. So with that, let's start with identifying the type of story you are working on. Are you working on a memoir, an autobiography, or journals, therapy? A quick note about the difference between the types of projects. Remember that a memoir is a story, a book that focuses just on one particular point in time in your life or one particular theme in your life. It won't start at birth and end in the present. So people may theoretically write more than one memoir in their life. And there are people that do write multiple memoirs about different themes and topics. An autobiography or a life story will start at the beginning of your life and sort of work chronologically, usually through to the end. So that's the difference. It doesn't really matter that much other than if you want to use the right term for what you're working on. And the rules are a little different depending on which type of story you have. If you're writing a life story of someone else, you would call that a biography or a life story or a family history. Again, we've talked in the past about journaling and the purpose of personal writing just for yourself, whether it's to capture your own thoughts, and it might be a bit of therapy, it might be just to catalog the daily details of life. Very often, your journals are mostly meant for you. You may intend to give them to other people, but largely your journals are a resource to help you process and to help you refer back later when you write a story with another audience in mind, where you want it to be engaging and beautifully written and inspiring. And that's where we put a little bit of effort into story structure and the writing process. So after you've identified the type of story you're working on, what your purpose is, I'll do a note about purpose. Is it just for you? And I know you may hesitate to think, oh, I'm just doing this for myself, but it's okay. You may be the most important audience for your story. I know that we all intend to give and that we want to give to our families, to future generations, to somebody who may be going through something hard like we've been through. And that is a wonderful and noble cause. And I'm definitely not telling you shouldn't be selfless in this process. I'm just encouraging you to embrace the fact that you're worth it, that writing it for you helps your own development, and you will become the person you're meant to be through the process of writing that. And that is an amazing, I've found in most projects, it's like a byproduct. We don't expect that it will change us as much as it does, but the writing process changes it. I've said many times, it's kind of my mantra that when you tell your story, it changes the ending. And I think that's really important. So you go with that. The next thing is, once you've sort of identified your purpose, what type of story, you got to get into the nitty gritty of how to write it, how you will approach it. One of the early decisions that you need to make is the point of view. Are you going to write it in the first person or the third person? First person being a narrative that says, I did this and I did that and I saw and this is what I experienced. Third person meaning he, she, they. So it's written with a more of an omniscient narrator. There are other stories that are written with a narrator as a character. I'm rereading The Book Thief right now, and the narrator of that great book is Death himself. So it's a great convention in that lovely novel. But most likely, if you're writing an autobiography or a memoir, it's going to be written in the first person. You could write it in the third person, but frankly, I think that's a little weird. I mean, you could. It just seems odd to write your own autobiography in the third person, like you're the king's she, he. Anyway, I digress. So then you have to decide whether you're going to write it in the past tense or the present tense. The most straightforward way of doing this is writing it in the past tense. So if it's your own story, first person, past tense, it will come the most naturally. It's the way that we tend to talk about our lives, the way we recall stories. But some people have more of an active voice, and you write it like, and I'm in this situation, and I'm doing this, and I did, and I see I was slipping into the past tense. I said did there. And there are autobiographies or memoirs that are written in the present tense. And these tend to have a very active voice. There's a lot of action. It feels like you're immersed in the story. And it can be a great and engaging way of doing it. But the caveat is it's tricky. And I've found that if you're not an experienced writer, staying consistent with writing in the present tense is hard. I also find that most new writers tend to slip in and out. They make mistakes and don't realize it. And you know what? It's okay. Like, don't get hung up on that because an editor can fix that. It's not that big of a deal. So it's something you want to give some thought to. Try to be consistent, but don't worry yourself about it too much. Definitely don't get bogged down. The next thing is to get into a writing routine. So, and that's probably the first thing. The thing I want to advise students, I try to do this in all my classes, it's to get you physically writing as quickly as humanly possible. Stop organizing the pencils on your desk. Stop getting your technology in order. Stop trying to get everything perfect. Don't do research in prime writing hours. Get a routine. So I like to, in class, give free write exercises where the assignment is to, well, in class, you don't have notifications on or you get the stink eye from me. So put your phones away, pretend I'm giving you the stink eye through the computer, and sit down with a timer on with a question prompt and let her rip for 20 minutes. And don't let that pencil or your keyboard stop until you have completed 20 minutes of good writing. If you can stay in that zone for an hour, all the better. But I love seeing what students can accomplish in a free write exercise in 20 minutes and what shows up out of the blue on the page. It's amazing what will surprise you and what you're capable of if you're not going down rabbit trails and procrastinating. So get writing as soon as you can and create a writing habit. Set aside the time every day to do it. The best writers will tell you that the muse shows up when the muse knows when and where to find you. There's an adage by a famous writer that says, yeah, I just write whenever I feel like it. And that happens to be at 9 a.m. every morning. The more you can create that kind of a habit, the better you'll do. You can write your book in 3 months if you sit down and write 500 words a day. So if you need some help and encouragement to create a habit, I've mentioned the great book, Atomic Habits by James Clear. It's a wonderful exercise on how to stack habits together, on how to create an environment where habits can thrive. I also love Stephen Pressfield's wonderful The War of Art. I've mentioned it many times, but it's all about overcoming procrastination and resistance and winning that creative battle that each of us must fight anew every dang day. I love how Stephen Pressfield talks about how once you've slayed that dragon, you've finished a project, it will never have the same power over you, but you still have to fight the dragon anew every single day. So if it feels frustrating that procrastination keeps dragging you back in, yeah, well, join the club. Everybody has to deal with it. So figure out a plan and do it anyway. So you now have an idea of kind of your approach, your whether you're going to do first person, third person, what type of story you're working on. You have a routine. Now, interview yourself. I mentioned writing prompts. I love to give writing prompts in class because a specific question will generate specific memories and specific stories. And the more you can focus on one vignette, a rabbit trail here about vignettes. Vignettes are short stories that are self-contained. They have a beginning, a middle, an end. They have a character. They have a problem, central conflict. They have a crescendo. They have a dark night of the soul. And they end with the hero showing some sort of transformation. In writing circles, even in marketing, people will talk about how you can write a vignette in a single 30-second commercial. The best television commercials will actually tell a little story in 30 seconds. Can you do that? Can you there are challenges to write an entire story in one line, one paragraph, but it's a great challenge to see if you can write one single little standalone story that contains all of those elements. If you can do that, guys, you can write your entire book because you do it once and then you repeat the process. Give yourself a writing prompt. Some of my favorites include, what was your first job? How did you meet? I love anything to do with beginnings. How did you get started with your hobby? How did you start your business? Because in those stories contain a why. They contain a beginning. They're exciting because it's the beginning of something new. They're also specific. I love to encourage you to write specific stories about a particular day when something happened. Then you dress it up with setting. You will add sensory details that bring the scene to life. Smell, taste, touch. Help your reader feel immersed in the scene by painting a picture. Now, you don't want to go on and on for pages. So one of the tricks is figuring out the best, most important, what I call the well-chosen detail. How do you know what's a well-chosen detail? Well, for one thing, I like to pick details that tend to stand in for the rest. One detail that sort of says it all, the one song that paints the picture of an era, the one piece of fashion that's sort of quintessential for that time. I also like to include details that come back later. Don't just include details for no good reason. Include them because they showcase the character traits of your protagonist and your supporting cast. They develop the character in some way. Insert details that you will call back to later. Someone once wrote, and I love this idea, that if you're writing a mystery and you walk in and there's a sword hanging over the fireplace, you'd better dang well include that sword later in chapter 7. So the readers love it when you call back to details later. They feel like they're in good hands every time you introduce a detail, and they later learn, oh, that was important. This isn't a writer that's just waxing eloquent for no good reason. These details are here for a purpose. So give them a little payoff. They will love it. They will reward you for it by continuing to read. Next, so I mentioned interviewing yourself, asking questions. And as a side note, if you're struggling with writing, consider that oral history is a completely viable option for getting your story done. I didn't realize that when I started this work, that oral history is the easiest, the most rewarding, the most wonderful way to get a story done. And for many people, oral history is all you need. Sit down, interview someone else, or have someone else interview you, or interview yourself and record it, and then transcribe it, print it, and call it good. You may not even need to edit it. You can pull those transcripts together. You can organize them. There's lots of things you can do with it. I use oral history as the source material for the stories that I'm working on. But I think it's important to give yourself permission that oral history may actually be the product. And as you develop this skill, you'll have the opportunity to interview other people as source material for your own story. And so it's a skill that will give you wonderful payoff in many contexts in the future. And I just encourage you to try your hand at it. You'll love it. It's powerful stuff. And it may just relieve you of the burden of thinking you have to sit down and write a book if writing isn't your strong suit, or if you're too busy living life to do it, or if you just find you've lost interest or don't want to do it. You don't have to. Okay, so next, I've talked about writing prompts and interviewing yourself, but I also would encourage you to be intentional about the types of stories that you're spending your time writing. It's fine to write fun and playful stories and just set a scene and share the history of your life, but there's a more important purpose here. And the purpose is to inspire others, to share your values, to bring your family together and help them understand this is who we are. You, my grandfather, you have this personality trait, and I have that personality trait too. You went through something hard. I'm going through something hard. And maybe, just maybe, there's a little spark of that fortitude, that goodness, that will to survive no matter what, kindness, compassion, humor, whatever it is that's your family traits. You want to tell those stories that share with your family what those values are and how you learned those values. So you could sit down and preach to your family and say, now, I want you to listen up. This is what's important in life. Do as I say. You already know that doesn't work, or you wouldn't be here trying to learn how to tell stories. You teach by storytelling. And the more specific the stories are, the more engaging and inspiring. So it's incumbent on you to do the work of figuring out what those stories are. And I call that repertoire of stories your own personal canon, your stories that you have carefully selected and curated. The selection process I call curating, and then you've edited them so that they're beautiful and they have all the good elements of storytelling, and they're going to inspire your readers to really have that change of heart and embrace those values just as you've done. So the process of gathering those, I call curating your personal canon of stories that showcase your values. Next, after you have a bunch of stories together and you've been writing regularly and just sitting down and letting her rip, I want to emphasize that the important thing to keep in mind, that was a wordy way of saying that, is I was editing, if I were editing this, I would take out all that wordiness, by the way. So in the first draft, though, you just get it down. Write a bad first draft, a steaming pile of garbage. I was just reading an article just this past week about one of the writers who wrote for the cartoon series on TV, The Simpsons. And he advocated this method. Stephen King does, Stephen Pressfield. I can't tell you how many people advocate getting something terrible down on the page as quickly as humanly possible. Why? Because momentum matters. Because when you're going quickly, it allows the reader to, when you're going quickly, it allows the muse to show up and surprise you. And it's easier. The writer for The Simpsons was talking about how he would write something really bad. He just put stand-in dialogue, cliche, not very good stuff, because once the writing is the hard part. Editing is much easier. Once you've got something on the page, then you can work with it. So get the hard part done first, and then come back the next day and do the editing and polish it and say, oh, I can write better than that crummy, cliched, hackneyed little bit of dialogue there. And then you spruce it up and you edit out all the wordiness, like I just did in my sentence a minute ago. Then, as I mentioned, you will focus on vignettes, one story at a time. They don't have to be in order. You can go back and place them in chronological order later. A note about that. The way to organize your project in almost every case is in chronological order. Even if you plan to do flashbacks and hail back to a prior time, especially if it's a memoir and you're only focusing on one time or theme in your life, you may have to call back to a previous time. But do it as the story unfolds, and when there's an important theme in a particular time in the story, then hail back to a prior story. It's choppy and difficult to flash back and forth and back and forth, or to organize it in any other way other than chronological order. You can try it. Some great writers do it. I'm just telling you that in every project I've worked on, we will experiment with different things, and we always come right back to chronological order. It works. And I find that the storyboard, the techniques of story structure and the rise and fall of the arc, it works even in a timeline. It's uncanny, it's weird, but it works. So I organize my vignettes. I don't always write them in chronological order. I might jump around as I'm writing, but I plunk them into the manuscript in order. And every time I have a new year appear, like it turns from 1956 to 1957, I'll do a little header at the top that says 1957. Those are just a convention in my writing that help me use the find function to jump around in a long document later. I organize all of my document in one place. I don't put them in multiple chapters, in multiple files, because it becomes impossible to find things. So that's how I do it. It's greatly simplified my life since I've done it that way. But again, I just plunk them into the manuscript in chronological order. And then later, if I want it to read as one seamless narrative, I employ a process that I call stitching. And I just go back in and I write simple little transitions to stitch one scene seamlessly into the next, so that the reader doesn't have any idea that you wrote them at different times. You'll get better at it with practice. It's not overly hard. You don't have to overdo it. Usually a couple of sentences will do to just tie one scene into the next. Something like, and a few months later, ... or, and things went along in much the same manner until ... that sort of thing. Don't overcomplicate it. But it is a process that you have to do in editing if you want it to read as one seamless narrative that sort of reads like a novel. Now, that said, doesn't have to. You do not have to write a book that reads like a novel. You can have just a series of standalone vignettes or essays and call it good. They don't have to be in order. They don't have to be organized by theme. They can simply be a series of short stories that tell the reader the things that make you, you. And that's perfectly good enough. And a little bit of philosophy about why I believe that's good enough. It's more than most people in the history of humanity have ever left. What I wouldn't give for one short story that showcases the personality of my ancestor. All of my ancestors, what I wouldn't give for one. So every one that you write is way more than most people ever get done. So there's your pep talk for today. Next, after I've done a first draft, then I worry about story structure. As much as I love me a good storyboard, you guys know it's one of my favorite things, I don't worry about it on the front end. I come back, and once I see what I've got, then I storyboard it, and I work on the process of heightening the good stuff, cutting the boring parts, and finding the beats that really make it emotionally engaging. I do that in the second draft. Some people love to outline on the front end. If you do that, more power to you. The storyboard works just as well in that framework, or in that sort of mode of working. There are sort of pantsters that work by the seat of their pants. There are plotters who like to plot everything out in advance. You don't have to be one or the other. There are great battles about which one is best, but I storyboard in the editing process. Next, pay attention to sensitive subjects. Don't go being a bull in a china shop through the difficult parts of your story. Pause, reflect, give yourself some self-care. Approach your family with delicate kid gloves. Be mindful, loving, prayerful. Don't ruin relationships because you charge in thinking that you're right. It's not worth it. Pause and do it the right way, and it may take some time. And in that spirit, I'm going to wrap up by saying this process may take you longer than you think. So be gentle with yourself. I am chronically thinking a project is going to be done quickly and I'm going to be done with it and we're going to publish it and it's going to be great. And then it takes me way longer than I think because the story grows and it sticks with my heart more and I want to make it better than I initially thought it would be. And I've changed and grown through the process. If I'm working through it with the client, my relationship has grown and changed. My understanding of them has grown and changed. And if you're working on your own story, you will be growing and changing. And sometimes that just requires a little time on the clock. You can't just sit down and go through a process of transformation in an afternoon. It takes a little time to be with it. So don't be mad at yourself and beat yourself up if you think it should be going faster. And life happens, and that's part of the process too. So that is my pep talk for you today on the overall process of writing your life story. You can do this. Trust me, you can. I know you can, and you should. It's one of the most important things you might do in your entire life. And I promise you, if you sit down and do something today, turn the timer on and work on one vignette. If you do something tomorrow, if you just keep doing a little bit at a time, it will be enough. If you do it now, it'll be enough. Even if you consider it unfinished, your posterity may be able to finish it. The resources will be there, or maybe it's done and you didn't realize it. So do it now and it will be enough. Remember that your story is told in moments, just like your life was lived in moments. I pray for you that this work will bless you and that it will inspire your loved ones and bring your family together and add a little more light in this mixed up world. That is why we're doing this. So I hope this has been helpful. I just encourage you in your work and I'm sending good vibes out there. You got this. Okay, over and out.